Are male authors being left behind? That's the question today because a brand new publisher, Conduit Books, has announced they'll exclusively publish literary fiction and memoirs written only by men. Now, on the surface, that sounds, outdated, maybe even outrageous. A publishing house that only wants to publish men in the year of our Lord 2025. For many, this announcement triggers an immediate eye roll, especially given how much men have historically dominated not just literature, but almost every creative field. The general consensus for years has been that we need to amplify underrepresented voices, like women, people of color, LGBTQ writers, and not go backwards. But the deeper I dug into this, the more complicated things became. The literary world isn't what it was 30 or even 10 years ago. There are real conversations happening about whether fiction, especially literary fiction, has swung dramatically in women's favor. And alongside that, there's a growing concern that boys and young men aren't reading much at all. Instead, they're finding role models and stories in places like the manosphere or hustle culture. Today, we'll unpack the controversy around the male-only publisher, whether men really are being left behind in fiction, and why a certain young author on BookTok, Luke Bateman, sparked even more questions when he landed a 2-book deal suspiciously easy. So let's dive deeper into what Jude Cook has said in his announcement of the publishing house. From spring 2026, the aim is to publish 3 outstanding novels, short story collections, or memoirs a year, launching with the emphasis on male writers. The press is actively looking for a launch book, preferably a debut novel by a male UK novelist under 35. They also ran a month-long open submissions window on their website, meaning unrepresented male authors could submit their works. Most publishers only accept submissions from authors who have a literary agent, regardless of their gender, as a way to vet quality, but the open submission opportunity was also one of Cook's methods to tackle the apparent barriers men now face in the industry. In a New York Times opinion piece by David J. Morris, he mentioned that he'd seen a 2022 tweet by the novelist Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote on Twitter that a friend who is a literary agent told me that he cannot even get editors to read first novels by young white male writers, no matter how good. Of course, there was a swift and cutting response to the tweet, especially in regards to Oates' emphasis on white males, as the book world has long been and still is overwhelmingly white. Though he continues to say, the lack of concern about the fate of male writers was striking. In his press release, Jude Cook continues to plead his case. He added, "We believe there is ambitious, funny, political, and cerebral fiction by men that is being passed by not only by the big 5 publishing houses, but by some independent presses too. Conduit Books seeks in a modest way to right this imbalance. Though not in any militant sense, publishing is and should remain a broad church, which is why it's always been a fertile environment for nurturing new literary talent, as well as supporting established names." So I'm just going to keep reading some more from his press release, and then I'm going to go through the points he made and sort of, provide a little bit of a rebuttal. He continues, "Over the past 15 years, the publishing landscape has changed dramatically. As a reaction to the occasionally toxic male-dominated literary scene of the 80s, 90s, and noughties, literary fiction by women has come into its own. Most of the excitement and energy around new and adventurous fiction is around women authors, and this is only right as a timely corrective." So there you go, a little bit of feminism sprinkled in. However, he said, Conduit Books will seek to publish a range of overlooked issues, including fatherhood, masculinity, working class male experience, sex, and relationships, and negotiating the 21st century as a man. When Jude Cook announced his publishing house and posted it on Instagram, there was a lot of praise as well as some criticism, including some eye rolls. One of the reasons people might be rolling their eyes a little bit at this male-only publisher thing is, history, specifically who's historically held the mic. And, for a long time, it was men, specifically white men. Back in the day, women weren't exactly encouraged to pursue writing or really any career that didn't involve cooking, cleaning, and raising children. If you did manage to publish, your work was often shoved into the neatly labeled box of women's fiction, a category that implied your stories were only relevant to other women. Interestingly, women actually temporarily dominated fiction in the 1790s, publishing more novels than men. But this was also the time when novels were the literary genre that paid the least and were seen as having the least intellectual value. And for generations, women who wanted to be taken seriously, to have their writing judged purely on merit, often resorted to adopting male pseudonyms. The Bronte sisters, you know them for Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and Agnes Grey, but originally they went by Currer, Alice, and Acton Bell, because a masculine name meant your work might actually be read and respected. Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, is another classic example. The wholesome domestic stories she's famous for weren't all she wanted to write. She had a darker side, fiery, revenge-fueled stories that didn't exactly fit the women and family mold. So she published those under the name A.M. Barnard, with titles like Pauline's Passion and Punishment and The Abbot's Ghost, which were both wildly successful. The frustration with a publisher saying only men allowed doesn't exactly come out of nowhere, as for a long time it seemed like that was sort of the unspoken rule with publishing houses in the past. It wasn't just publishing deals where women were left behind. When it came to the big literary prizes, the numbers were just as dismal. Take the Booker Prize, one of the most prestigious awards in fiction. For decades, it was mostly won by men. In fact, in 1996, none of the shortlisted novels were by women, even though women wrote 60% of all novels published that year. That statistic raised a lot of eyebrows and led to the creation of the Women's Prize for Fiction, originally called the Orange Prize. The idea was to help correct the imbalance and make sure women's writing actually got the recognition it deserved. But ironically, in the years following the launch of that prize, the percentage of women winning other major literary awards actually went down, and it didn't start improving until around 2003. So I found a graph on theconversation.com tracking this trend. It shows that in 2012, women won 53% of the UK's top literary prizes, but after that it plateaued. Over the next decade, the average hovered around 45%. But the numbers do seem to bounce all over the place. Just 21% of winners were women in 2016, then it jumped to 64% in 2017. So yeah, at least when it comes to awards and recognition, men on average are still slightly ahead. And without women-only prizes like the Women's Prize for Fiction, that gap would likely be even bigger. That said, there has been some real progress, perhaps even a flip. Just last year, 5 of the 6 books shortlisted for the Booker Prize were by women, and the winner was Samantha Harvey for her book Orbital. But when it comes to non-fiction, women are still lagging behind. Female non-fiction writers get paid less, get fewer reviews, win fewer prizes, and unsurprisingly, sell fewer books. That's led to the creation of yet another prize, the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. Part of the imbalance in non-fiction, as The Guardian points out, has been a historical perception of male expertise, particularly on certain topics. As with bias in class and race, publishing has been slow to address this proactively. One of the more interesting points Jude Cook raises in his press release, and something I've seen echoed in op-eds, is the idea that young men and boys just aren't reading fiction anymore. Instead, they're being pulled into online spaces dominated by influencers and manosphere voices, people like Jordan Peterson. In an article by writer Jason Diamond, he reflects on this exact issue. He talks about how, as a young man, getting into fiction, starting with J.D. Salinger and Kafka, was a transformative experience. It gave him perspective, emotional depth, and basically made him a better person. Curious about what young men might stumble across today, he did a little experiment. He Googled how to be a better man. One of the first results was a Jordan Peterson Reddit forum, and scrolling through it, what he found was telling. He found young men searching for meaning, for guidance, and mostly being handed advice about hitting the gym, eating right, grinding in the workplace, but almost nothing about developing a sense of interior life, about curiosity, creativity, emotional intelligence, emotional literacy. And when those topics did come up, they were often framed by questionable authorities like Peterson. Diamond also points out how so many male influencers outright tell young men that reading, especially fiction, is a waste of time. Worse than that, it's unproductive, it's useless, it's a women's hobby. But why is reading fiction seen as a woman's hobby in the first place? Well, part of it might be visibility. Fiction by women has never been more prominent, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, fewer people overall are reading fiction, and especially fewer men. The fact that fewer people are reading fiction at the same time that women are winning more awards could suggest we are witnessing a repeat of the familiar pattern in women's history, where at the same historical moment when women achieve dominance or increase in a field and it becomes feminized, the field as a whole loses its value or prestige. Examples include family medicine or humanities professors. In other words, when women start to dominate a space, that space is often seen culturally as less important. In 2023, women authored 57% of the top 500 best-selling novels, but while 44% of women read fiction by male authors, only 19% of men read fiction written by women. So it seems this unfortunate bias still lingers, that a lot of men aren't willing to read books written by women. And maybe that's why they gravitate more towards non-fiction, which is still heavily male-dominated. But fiction and non-fiction aren't interchangeable. They offer completely different things. As Jason Diamond writes in his article, and I think this sums it up beautifully, I truly believe my sliding doors moment was that high school English teacher telling me to check out Kafka. Without a trace of irony, I can say that getting into fiction probably saved my life. It definitely made me a better person. Fiction gives men something the manosphere never will: emotional literacy, a sense of interiority, and a way to imagine lives beyond dominance, hustle culture, and status. The problem isn't that fiction doesn't exist for young men, it does. The problem is no one's introducing it to them. But here's where it gets interesting, because despite all the talk of men being left behind in fiction, we're actually seeing some prominent male voices thriving in spaces like BookTok. Take Luke Bateman, former rugby player, bachelor contestant turned BookToker. His channel blew up in a matter of months, and off the back of that, he secured a 2-book deal. No published writing experience, just a platform and some loose story ideas. Naturally, that sparked some backlash. People were frustrated, understandably, because it didn't exactly seem like a merit-based opportunity, but it also shows that, men aren't exactly shut off from the literary world. I don't think him being male was at all a detriment to him getting that book deal. So, circling back to Conduit Books, this new male-only publishing house founded by Jude Cook, here's where I land. Yes, young men should be encouraged to read more fiction, to seek out a diverse range of voices, to explore ideas beyond hustle culture and the manosphere. And sure, maybe that encouragement starts in schools with better reading programs. Men should also be encouraged to write, just like women should. But when you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue that men are being seriously sidelined. So do I think Cook's male-only publishing house is some massive threat to equality? Honestly, no. But hey, that's just my take. What do you think? Is this a step backwards or just another weird twist in the ever-changing literary world? Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you wanna. Bye.